Ambassador had served the Galactic Council for 300 cycles. In that time, he had seen things that would break lesser beings. He had walked through the burning cities of Prime during the Great Silicon Wars. He had stood before the warlords and negotiated peace while their ships pointed weapons at his head. He had witnessed the collapse of the Empire and helped rebuild what was left. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing scared him. He was the Council's finest diplomat, and he wore that title like armor. So when the High Arbiter called him to the central chamber and told him about a new assignment, expected nothing special. He walked into the room with his hands folded behind his back and his face calm. The chamber was vast, with walls made of living crystal that shifted colors based on the mood of those inside. Today, the crystals glowed a soft blue, which meant the council was at peace. The High Arbiter sat on an elevated platform, her ancient body wrapped in robes that seemed to float around her. She was over 2,000 cycles old, one of the oldest beings in the known galaxy. Her eyes were silver, and they saw everything. She said, her voice echoing through the chamber, "We have discovered a new species." Nodded slowly. New species were found every few decades. Most were primitive, some were dangerous. A few were interesting enough to contact. The process was always the same. Send an observer, study them, make a decision. Where? Asked. A small planet in the outer spiral arm, the High Arbiter replied. A holographic image appeared in the air between them. It showed a blue and green world covered in swirling white clouds. They call it Earth. The species calls itself humanity. Studied the image. The planet was beautiful in a simple way. He had seen thousands of worlds, and this one did not stand out. It was small. It was young. The readings showed a breathable atmosphere, liquid water, and a single dominant species with basic technology. They have only recently achieved space travel, the High Arbiter continued. Their first steps beyond their atmosphere happened less than a century ago by their time measurement. They have sent machines to nearby planets but have not yet established colonies. Primitive, said. It was not an insult. It was simply a fact. By galactic standards, a species that had not colonized at least 3 worlds was considered to be in its infancy. Yes, the High Arbiter agreed, but there is something unusual about them. She waved her hand and the holographic image changed. Now it showed data streams, historical records, and biological scans, watched as information flowed past him. The humans were fragile creatures. Their bodies were soft and easily damaged. They lived for less than 100 of their years, which was barely a moment by galactic standards. They needed constant food, water, and rest to survive. Their planet was hostile to them in many ways, filled with predators and diseases and natural disasters. And yet they had survived, more than survived. They had spread across their entire world. They had built cities and machines. They had developed art and music and literature. They had split the atom and reached for the stars. They are divided, the High Arbiter said. Their world is broken into hundreds of separate nations that often fight each other. They have weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and they have come close to using them more than once. They suffer from disease, poverty, and violence. By all logical measures, they should have destroyed themselves long ago. Frowned, this was not unusual for young species. Many civilizations went through violent phases before finding peace. Some destroyed themselves. Some matured. It was the natural order of things. What makes them worth my attention? He asked. The High Arbiter was silent for a moment. The crystals on the walls flickered, shifting from blue to something he had never seen before, a color he could not name. We do not know, she admitted. Our long-range scans show patterns we cannot explain, emotional readings that do not match any species in our records. We need someone on the ground, someone who can observe them directly and tell us what they are. Understood. This was not a simple assessment mission. The Council was uncertain, and uncertainty was rare for beings who had mapped most of the known universe. What is my objective? He asked. "Observe them," the High Arbiter said. "Live among them, learn what they are. Then return and tell us if they are worthy of contact or if they pose a threat that must be contained before they spread beyond their world." Accepted the mission with a simple nod. He had done this many times before. He would go to this planet, watch these humans for a few months, and return with a report. It would be routine work, perhaps even boring. He spent the next several days preparing. His ship was equipped with cloaking technology that would make it invisible to human detection systems. He studied their languages and chose to focus on one called English, which was widely spoken. He learned about their cultures, their history, and their biology. He created a disguise that would allow him to walk among them without being noticed. When everything was ready, boarded his ship and set course for Earth. The journey took several weeks, and he spent the time reviewing more data. He read about their wars, their religions, their governments. He studied their art and found it crude but occasionally interesting. He listened to their music and found it chaotic but sometimes pleasant. By the time his ship entered Earth's solar system, felt confident that he understood these humans. They were a young species struggling to grow up. They had potential, but they also had many flaws. He would observe them, confirm his conclusions, and return to the council with a recommendation. He landed his ship in a rural area of a nation called the United States of America. It was nighttime, and the sky was filled with stars. Stepped out of his ship and took his first breath of Earth air. It was thick and wet compared to what he was used to, but it was breathable. He looked around at the dark fields and distant lights of a small town. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The wind carried the smell of grass and soil. Felt nothing special. It was just another world, just another species. He had no idea how wrong he was. He walked toward the lights of the town, ready to begin his observation, ready to study these fragile, short-lived creatures and determine their fate. He did not know that in the coming months, these same creatures would shake the foundations of everything he believed. He did not know that he would return to the council a changed being, with eyes that had seen something no galactic citizen had ever witnessed. He did not know that humanity was about to teach him what it truly meant to be alive. But he would learn. One human at a time, he would learn. Spent his first week on Earth walking through the small town he had landed near. It was called, and it sat in the middle of a region called Ohio. The town was unremarkable by any standard. A few thousand humans lived there, going about their daily lives in patterns that seemed simple and repetitive. He watched them from a distance at first. He sat in places they called coffee shops and diners, drinking bitter liquids and eating strange foods while observing their behavior. They talked about weather and sports and politics. They complained about their jobs and their families. They laughed at jokes that did not understand. It all seemed so ordinary, so small. Then he met Danny Marsh. Danny was a construction worker. First noticed him at a gas station early one morning. The man was filling up a large truck, his clothes already dirty from work that had not yet begun. He was in his late 30s with rough hands and tired eyes. There was nothing special about him. He looked like hundreds of other humans had seen. But something made decide to follow him. Perhaps it was the way Danny moved, slow and heavy, like a man carrying something invisible on his back. Perhaps it was the small photograph taped to the dashboard of his truck, showing a smiling woman with brown hair. Followed Danny to a construction site outside of town. He watched from a hidden position as Danny worked for 10 straight hours under a hot sun. The work was brutal. Danny lifted heavy materials, operated loud machines, and climbed dangerous scaffolding. Sweat soaked through his clothes. His body moved with the stiffness of old injuries. During a short break, another worker approached Danny and asked him something. Danny smiled and nodded. They talked for a few minutes, and then Danny reached into his pocket and pulled out some paper money. He handed it to the other worker, who looked surprised and grateful. Danny waved off the thanks and went back to work. accessed his scanning device, and began building a profile on Danny Marsh. What he found made him pause. Danny's wife had been named Karen. She had died 3 years ago from something called cancer, a disease that slowly destroyed her body from the inside. The medical records showed that Karen had fought the disease for 2 years before it finally won. During that time, Danny had worked 2 jobs to pay for her treatments while also caring for their 2 children. The treatments had not worked. Karen had died in a hospital bed holding Danny's hand. After her death, Danny had sold their house to pay off the medical debts. He had moved into a smaller place with his children, a daughter named Lily who was now 10, and a son named Ben who was 8. He worked 6 days a week to support them. He had not taken a vacation or a true day of rest in over a year. Read this information and felt something strange stir inside him. On his, such a loss would have been devastating. Citizens who experienced major trauma were given extensive psychological treatment and often entered isolation for years to recover. Some never returned to normal life. But Danny Marsh had buried his wife and gone back to work the following week. Not because he wanted to, but because his children needed to eat, because bills needed to be paid, because life did not stop just because his heart had been broken. Continued to observe Danny for several weeks. He watched Danny wake up at 5 in the morning when the sky was still dark. He watched Danny make breakfast for his children before they went to school. He watched Danny kiss them goodbye at the bus stop and then drive 40 minutes to work, where he would spend 10 hours doing labor that slowly wore down his body. And then every evening Danny would come home, tired, aching, covered in dust and sweat, and he would transform. Watched through windows as Danny helped Lily with her math homework, patiently explaining problems over and over until she understood. He watched Danny play catch with Ben in the backyard, teaching him how to throw a baseball even though his arm was sore from work. He watched Danny cook dinner, simple meals that he had learned to make from videos on a device called a phone. One night watched Danny sit on the edge of Lily's bed. Lily was crying. She missed her mother. She did not understand why her mother had to die. She asked Danny questions that had no good answers. Danny did not have answers, but he held his daughter and stroked her hair and told her stories about Karen. He told her about the day they met, how Karen had laughed at his terrible jokes. He told her about the day Lily was born, how Karen had cried with happiness. He told her that Karen loved her more than anything in the world, and that love did not end just because someone was gone. Lily eventually fell asleep. Danny stayed with her for a long time, just watching her breathe. Then he went to his own room and sat on the bed he used to share with his wife. He looked at her photograph on the nightstand. And for the first time since he'd been watching, Danny Marsh cried. It was quiet. It was brief. He buried his face in his hands and let the pain out for just a few minutes. Then he wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and went to check on Ben. Stood outside in the darkness, invisible, watching through the window. His heart was beating fast, which was strange. He was trained to remain emotionally detached during observations. He had watched civilizations fall without feeling anything. But watching this one man, this fragile human with his short life and his broken heart, something inside shifted. Danny Marsh had every reason to give up. He had lost the woman he loved. He worked a job that was slowly destroying his body. He was tired all the time. He had debts and worries and no one to share them with. And yet every morning he got up. He made breakfast. He kissed his children. He went to work. He came home and helped with homework and played catch and cooked dinner. He carried his grief like a stone in his chest and still found the strength to smile. Had seen many things in his 300 cycles of life. He had seen wonders and horrors beyond description, but he had never seen anything like Danny Marsh. He had never seen anyone carry so much weight and still keep walking. For the first time since arriving on Earth, began to wonder if he had underestimated these humans. For the first time, he felt something that might have been respect. And somewhere deep inside him, something that had been asleep for a very long time began to wake up. After 2 months of watching, Danny Marsh decided to expand his observation. He had learned much from one human, but he needed to see more. He needed to understand if Danny was unusual or if there were others like him. He traveled to a large city called Chicago. It was nothing like the quiet town of. Chicago was loud and crowded and full of energy. Millions of humans lived there, packed together in buildings that reached toward the sky. They moved through the streets like water flowing through rivers, always rushing somewhere, always busy. Found the chaos overwhelming at first. His senses were flooded with sounds and smells and movement. But he adjusted, as he always did, and began to search for his next subject. He found her in a place called Mercy General Hospital. Her name was Maria. She was 42 years old, with dark hair that was starting to show gray and eyes that had seen too much. She worked as a trauma surgeon, which meant she spent her nights trying to save people who were dying. Chose to observe her because of something he noticed when he first saw her. She had just finished a long surgery and she was walking down a hospital hallway. Her hands were shaking slightly. Her face was pale. But when a younger doctor stopped her to ask a question, Maria's expression changed completely. She smiled. She spoke calmly. She gave advice with patience and kindness. Then when the young doctor walked away, Maria's smile disappeared. She kept walking, her shoulders heavy, her steps slow. Recognized that look. It was the same look Danny Marsh had when he thought no one was watching. The look of someone carrying weight they never put down. He decided to follow Maria through her shifts. What he saw over the next several weeks changed him in ways he did not expect. Maria worked nights. She arrived at the hospital when the sun was setting and did not leave until it rose again. During that time, she dealt with things that would break most beings: gunshot wounds, car accidents, stabbings, burns. Every kind of damage that humans could inflict on themselves and each other came through the doors of her emergency room. On one night that would never forget, Maria performed 3 surgeries in a row. The first was a young woman who had been hit by a drunk driver. Maria worked for 4 hours to stop the internal bleeding and repair the damage. When she finished, the woman was still alive. Maria allowed herself a small nod of satisfaction before moving to the next patient. The second surgery was a child, a 6-year-old boy who had fallen from a balcony. His injuries were severe. Maria operated for 3 hours fighting to save him. She succeeded. The boy would walk again. He would play again. He would live. But the third patient was different. His name was Tyler. He was 23 years old. He had been shot in the chest during a robbery at a gas station. He was not the robber. He was just a customer who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maria operated on Tyler for 2 hours, watched through the observation window as she worked with incredible skill, her hands moving with precision even though she had been awake for over 15 hours. She tried everything. She gave Tyler every chance she could give. But some wounds are too deep. Some damage cannot be undone. Tyler died on the operating table at 4:47 in the morning. Maria stepped back from the table. She looked at Tyler's face for a long moment. Then she pulled off her gloves and walked out of the operating room, followed her, invisible. She went to a quiet hallway near a stairwell. She pressed her forehead against the cold wall, and she cried. It was not a long cry, counted 90 seconds. Maria allowed herself 90 seconds of grief, 90 seconds of pain, 90 seconds of feeling the full weight of what had happened. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve. She took 3 deep breaths. She straightened her back. And she walked back to work. There was another patient waiting, a car accident victim. Maria scrubbed her hands, put on fresh gloves, and went back into surgery. She worked for another 3 hours and saved another life. Watched all of this in silence. He could not look away. He could not understand. Later, when Maria's shift finally ended, she drove home in the early morning light. Her house was in a quiet neighborhood. Her husband, Greg, was still sleeping when she arrived. She kissed his forehead without waking him. She checked on her two children, a teenage girl and a younger boy who were getting ready for school. Her daughter asked her how work was. Maria said it was fine. She smiled. She made jokes. She pretended that she had not just watched a young man die on her table. Then, when her family left and the house was empty, Maria sat alone in her kitchen. She drank coffee and watched the sun rise, and she opened a small notebook that she kept in a drawer. Moved closer to see what she was writing. The notebook was filled with names, hundreds of names written in small, careful handwriting. Each name was followed by a date. Maria wrote Tyler's name at the bottom of the list. She added the date. Then she closed the notebook and put it away. Accessed the notebook through his scanning device and read all the names. They were patients. Patients Maria had lost over the course of her career, every single one of them. She remembered them all. She carried them all. And still she went back, night after night, year after year. She walked into that hospital knowing that she would lose some patients, knowing that she would watch people die despite her best efforts, knowing that each loss would carve another scar into her soul. But she went back because some patients could be saved, because the 6-year-old boy would see his mother again, because the young woman would walk at her wedding, because for every Tyler there were others who got to live because Maria refused to quit. Stood in Maria's kitchen, invisible, watching her drink her coffee. His hands were trembling. His mind was racing. The Galactic Council had technology that made such work unnecessary. They had healing machines that could repair any damage. They had defeated death itself. No one on his had watched a patient die in thousands of cycles. But they had also lost something. Something was only now beginning to understand. They had lost the weight, the meaning, the terrible, beautiful cost of caring so much that failure broke your heart. Maria knew that cost. She paid it every night, and she chose to keep paying it because the lives she saved were worth the price. Had called these humans primitive. He had called them fragile. He had thought he understood them. He was beginning to realize he understood nothing at all. The months passed, and traveled across the country called America. He no longer felt like an observer studying primitive creatures. He felt like a student learning something important, something that his 300 cycles of experience had never taught him. He went to a small school in a poor neighborhood of a city called Detroit. There he found a woman named. She was 58 years old and had been a teacher for 32 years. The school where she worked had old buildings, broken equipment, and not enough money for basic supplies. Earned a salary that barely covered her own bills. She had no extra money. She lived in a small apartment and drove an old car that broke down often. By any measure, she was struggling. And yet watched her spend $200 of her own money to buy notebooks and pencils and books for her students. She did this every year. She did this knowing she would never be paid back, knowing that no one would thank her, knowing that it meant she would have to skip meals sometimes to make it to the end of the month. When asked himself why she did it, he found the answer in her face, in the way she smiled when a struggling student finally understood a math problem, in the way her eyes lit up when a quiet child raised their hand for the first time, gave her money because she could not bear to see her students go without, because their success meant more to her than her own comfort. Traveled to a city called Houston. There he followed a firefighter named Chris Medina into a burning building. The building was collapsing. The heat was beyond anything a human body should survive. Every logical calculation said that going inside was suicide. Chris went inside anyway. There was a family trapped on the 3rd floor, a mother and her 2 children. Chris carried them out one by one, going back into the flames each time. His gear was melting. His lungs were filling with smoke. His body was screaming at him to stop. He did not stop. He saved all 3 of them. Afterward, as Chris sat on the ground coughing and gasping for air, A little girl broke free from her mother and ran to him. She was crying. She held out a small stuffed dog that was burned and dirty. Her dog was still inside, she said. Her real dog, the one that slept on her bed every night. Chris looked at the building. It was almost fully engulfed now. No sane person would go back in for an animal. Chris went back in. He came out carrying a small brown dog that was terrified but alive. The little girl screamed with joy and hugged Chris so hard he almost fell over. Her mother was crying. The other firefighters were shaking their heads in disbelief. When someone asked Chris why he had risked his life for a dog, he shrugged. The girl was crying, he said. He could not stand to see a child cry if there was something he could do about it. Stood in the crowd watching this, and he felt something wet on his face. He touched his cheek and realized he was crying. He had not cried in over 100 cycles. He traveled to a small town in Pennsylvania. There he found an old man named Harold Price. Harold was 82 years old. He had fought in something called the Vietnam War when he was young. He had seen things that still gave him nightmares. He had lost friends in ways too terrible to describe. Despite all of this, Harold had built a good life. He had married his high school sweetheart, a woman named. They had raised 3 children together. They had been happy. But 2 years ago had developed something called dementia. Her mind was slowly fatting. She no longer remembered her children's names. She no longer remembered her own address. Most days, she did not remember Harold. Lived in a special care home now, and every single day Harold drove 45 minutes to visit her. He sat with her for hours. He held her hand. He talked to her about their life together, even though she did not understand. One day followed Harold into his room. He stood in the corner, invisible, and watched. Looked at Harold with confused eyes. She asked him who he was. Harold smiled gently. He introduced himself like he was meeting her for the first time. He told her his name was Harold Price. He told her she was very beautiful. He asked if he could hold her hand. Said yes. She seemed to like this friendly stranger. Harold held her hand and told her a story. He told her about a boy who met a girl at a dance when he was 17. He told her how the girl had worn a blue dress and how the boy thought she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. He told her how the boy was too shy to ask her to dance, but the girl walked up to him and asked him instead. Listened with wide eyes. She did not know she was the girl in the story, but she smiled anyway. She said it sounded like a nice story. Harold agreed. He said it was the best story he knew. Left that room and walked outside into the cold air. He stood in the parking lot for a long time, trying to understand what he had just seen. Harold Price knew that his wife would never remember him again. He knew that every day he would have to introduce himself to the woman he had loved for 60 years. He knew that she was slowly disappearing, piece by piece, and that there was nothing he could do to stop it. And he came back anyway, every day, because love was not about what you received, it was about what you gave. And Harold would give everything he had until there was nothing left to give. Had seen many forms of strength in the galaxy. He had seen warriors who could defeat entire armies. He had seen minds that could solve problems beyond comprehension. He had seen beings who had conquered death itself. But he had never seen anything as strong as an old man holding his wife's hand and telling her their love story for the 1,000th time, knowing she would forget it by tomorrow. This, realized, was what made humans different. Not their technology, not their intelligence, not their physical abilities. It was their hearts. They knew that life was short. They knew that pain was inevitable. They knew that everyone they loved would eventually be lost, and they chose to love anyway. They chose to hope anyway. They chose to keep going when every logical reason said they should stop. They burned with a fire that nothing could put out, not grief, not loss, not the certainty of death. And that fire, understood now, was the most powerful force in the universe. He had his answer. He knew what he would tell the council. But he also knew that the words would be difficult to find. Because how do you explain fire to beings who have forgotten what it means to burn? Ship broke through the atmosphere of Earth for the last time on a cold winter morning. He had been on the planet for 11 months. He had walked its cities and towns. He had watched its people laugh and cry and struggle and survive. He had learned things that no amount of data could have taught him. As his ship rose into the darkness of space, looked back at the blue planet growing smaller in his viewport, he thought about Danny Marsh, who was probably waking up right now to make breakfast for his children. He thought about Maria, who was probably finishing another night of saving lives. He thought about and Chris and Harold and all the others he had observed. They would never know he had been there. They would never know that their ordinary lives had shaken an ambassador of the Galactic Council to his core. The journey back to Council space took several weeks. Spent most of that time alone in his quarters, staring at the walls, trying to find the right words for what he needed to say. He had written thousands of reports in his career. They had all been easy. They had been filled with data and analysis and logical conclusions. This report would be different. This report would require him to describe something that data could not capture. When his ship finally docked at the council station, felt a heaviness in his chest that had not been there before. His steps were slow as he walked through the familiar corridors. The walls were clean and perfect, made of materials that would last for. The air was carefully regulated. Everything was controlled. Everything was safe. It felt empty. Entered the grand chamber where the High Arbiter and the assembled delegates waited. There were hundreds of them, representatives from dozens of species across the galaxy. They sat in elevated seats arranged in a great circle, looking down at the central platform where would deliver his assessment. The chamber fell silent as he walked to the platform. The crystals on the walls, which usually glowed with calm colors, seemed uncertain. They flickered between shades that had no names. The High Arbiter spoke first. Her ancient voice echoed through the chamber. "Ambassador, you have returned from your observation of the species called humanity. We are ready to receive your assessment. Tell us what you have found. Are they a threat that must be contained, or are they worthy of contact?" Stood in silence for a long moment. He looked at the faces around him. These beings had lived for thousands of cycles. They had built empires that spanned galaxies. They had conquered disease and death and conflict. They were the most advanced civilizations in the known universe. And they were waiting for him to tell them about a species that lived on a broken planet and died after less than a century. He began to speak. His voice was quiet at first, but it carried through the chamber. "Humanity," he said, "is exactly what our preliminary reports suggested. They are fragile. Their bodies break easily. They are vulnerable to countless diseases and dangers. They live for less than 100 of their years, which is barely a moment by our standards." The delegates nodded. This was expected. This was what the data had shown. "Their world is divided," continued. "They have hundreds of nations that disagree on almost everything. They fight wars. They commit terrible acts against each other. They have weapons capable of destroying their planet, and they have come close to using them." More nodding, more confirmation of what they already believed. "By every logical measure," said, "they should not be a concern to us. They are primitive. They are self-destructive. They will likely destroy themselves before they ever reach the stars in any meaningful way." He paused. The chamber was very quiet now. "But I did not come here to tell you what the data shows. I came here to tell you what I saw." His voice grew stronger. "I saw a man bury his wife and then teach his daughter to ride a bicycle the next morning because he had promised her he would. He was broken inside. He was exhausted. He had every reason to give up. But he got up and he kept his promise and he helped his child smile." The delegates shifted uncomfortably. This was not the kind of report they were used to hearing. "I saw a doctor lose a patient on an operating table. She cried for 90 seconds in a hallway. Then she wiped her face and went back to save another life. She has lost hundreds of patients. She carries every single one of them, and she goes back every night because the ones she can save are worth the pain of the ones she cannot. His hands were trembling now. I saw a man run into a burning building 3 times to save strangers. I saw him go back a 4th time to save a child's dog because the child was crying and he could not bear to see it. He nearly died, and when I asked him why, he said he just did not want the little girl to be sad. The chamber was completely silent. Even the High Arbiter's ancient eyes seemed uncertain. I saw an old man visit his wife every day in a care home. She does not remember him. Every day, he introduces himself like a stranger. Every day, he tells her the story of how they met. Every day, he holds her hand and loves her, even though she will forget him by tomorrow. Look directly at the High Arbiter. We have conquered death. We have eliminated suffering. We have built a civilization that will last until the stars burn out. But somewhere along the way, we forgot what it means to live with the full weight of mortality pressing down on every moment. His voice cracked slightly, but he did not stop. Humans know they are going to die. They know that everyone they love will die. They know that everything they build will eventually turn to dust, and they choose to love anyway. They choose to hope anyway. They choose to keep fighting when there is no logical reason to fight. Took a breath. They carry grief that would destroy us. They endure pain that we have engineered out of existence. And they do not break. They bend. They suffer. They cry in hallways and parking lots and empty kitchens. And then they get up and they keep going and they find reasons to smile. He looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. You asked me if humanity is a threat. They are not. You asked me if they are worthy of contact. That is not for me to decide, but I will tell you what they are. His voice was barely above a whisper now, but every being in the chamber heard him clearly. They are a mirror, and when I looked into that mirror, I saw everything we have lost. I saw the fire that we put out when we made ourselves immortal. I saw the meaning that we sacrificed when we eliminated struggle. I saw the love that only exists when you know that loss is inevitable. He straightened his back and spoke his final words. Humanity taught me that living forever means nothing if you have forgotten how to live at all. Ambassador turned and walked out of the chamber. He did not wait for questions. He did not wait for a response. He walked past the guards and the delegates and the ancient walls, and he did not stop until he reached the observation deck where he could see the stars. Behind him, the council sat in stunned silence. The crystals on the walls had stopped flickering. They had settled on a color none of them had ever seen before. And somewhere, 40,000 light-years away, Danny Marsh was teaching his son how to throw a curveball in the fading light of a winter afternoon. He did not know that his small, stubborn act of love had shaken an empire. He was just a father, playing catch with his boy, enjoying the simple miracle of being alive. And that, finally understood, was the most powerful thing in the universe.